Hi, I'm going to talk today about art terms, and I'm going to go over some common terms that are used in art history. For some of you, this is review, but for some of you, this is new material. But I always think it's good to start the semester with kind of going over some of the basics. So let me move on with art terms. Jackson Pollock, well known. I think most of you know that name. People tend to either love him or hate him. And Jackson Pollock, this is his work called Yellow Islands, 1952, and it's large, 56 inches by 6 feet, 1 inch. And he is an abstract expressionist, so that's the term I want you to know here. So an abstract expressionist is the same as a New York school. These were artists that was about the process. He'd actually listen to jazz music. He would almost dance while he prepared these large-scale works. These were not on easels. They were in a large format in a barn in the Hamptons. It was when he moved from the small spaces of New York apartments and into the country and where he had more space that he was able to transition and develop this sort of action painting. He's been called Jack the Dripper. He was in art Life magazine, and he was kind of featured and was a big deal. People actually used to come out and just to watch him work. It's an American movement. It's not associated with European art, and I think that's one of the reasons why it commands such high prices in the marketplace. Jackson Pollock's number 5 sold for $140 million, and it held the record for a long, long time. As far as people saying, oh, anyone can do it, but they didn't. Simple concept, but very, very different look. And he was the originator of it. You know, if you or I go into the driveway and throw down some canvas and start throwing paint, it's not very exciting. But in the 1950s, it was exciting. Many artists believe following too many rules stifle artists. I would be one that believes that. But in any case, he was a rule breaker. Uh, I've often heard people say, my granddaughter could do this, a 5-year-old could do it. No, they can't. They're very, very large scale. I've taught many, many 5-year-olds, and the idea of returning to a childlike form is actually something that Picasso aspired to. He is one that said, it took me years to figure out how to paint like a child. And these works are, again, repetitive. They're usually done with house enamel. Sometimes they have cigarettes in them, little cigarette butts in them, a coin that might be embedded in them, sort of pieces of trash that you might get in your garage that was in this barn. Those are embedded in them. And so, again, they command huge prices in the marketplace. So to quote Picasso, he said, it took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child. And this is, again, by Picasso. This work is Woman with a Book. This is at the Norton Simon Museum, and it was produced in the 1930s. I think that's kind of the peak of his work. His work was really quite lovely in the 1930s, and that's simply opinion. A lot of other people have other works that they love. However, the Dream, or La Rive, as it's perhaps more well known, was recently sold for, again, 130 million plus. So again, some of these works command huge prices. Now, this one has some similarities to The Dream, but it's a highlight at the Norton Simon. And when we get to go back to museums, it's something everyone should see. The model for this was Marie Therese. She was a very young girl. He was an older gentleman at the time. And she had a relationship with Picasso, as did many other women for that matter. Abstraction. This is Kandinsky. He's considered the father of abstraction. And this is one of his studies of compositions. And he would often give them these kind of musical names. And abstraction is non-representational, non-objective. The heyday of abstraction was the early 20th century, and artists who employed abstraction to basically pull away from the real world. Um, the forms are often simplified, stylized, distilled. It's about color, texture, gesture, line, and scale. And again, they could do whatever they wanted. He's the father of abstraction because he was doing it for the first time in the early 1900s, so it really wasn't something that was a thing yet. He actually was painting in a very representational way. He leaned the painting up against the wall, leaves the room, comes back in, and it's in a different format. It's on its side or it's upside down. One of the weird things art historians argue about. But the point being, it wasn't in its correct format. And so when it was turned, he walked into the room and he went, oh, I kind of like that. And abstraction was born. So here's another example of abstraction. And this particular work is by Robert Motherwell. Robert Motherwell produced around 130 plus paintings of these works, complete abstractions. You would never probably guess the name, and it is Elegy to the Spanish Republic. And he did a number of these. Changed the number, the year might change, but again, a huge number of them. So you're all Robert Motherwell experts because, again, this preoccupied him for a long, long time. And I don't know why artists do that, where you suddenly get obsessed with painting haystacks, Claude Monet, or water lilies, Claude Monet, or in Renoir's situation, he happened to love beautiful nude women in his later life and painted a number of them. Again, I don't know. It's just one of those things artists sometimes do. So Robert Motherwell was married for a while to Helen Frankenthaler, and he was one of the youngest of the abstract expressionists. And this is yet another one of those elegies. So let me move on. Oh my, another one. This is 1960s, and this is Elegy to the Spanish Republic, number 108. Now this one has some color to it. When you see these, most of them are very large, and sometimes they almost look unfinished. Looks like someone spilled something, looks like someone's coffee was set there. He didn't worry about it. Very much an expression. And it was an expression of kind of depression. I mean, he was preoccupied with war, and he didn't like what was going on. And he basically said, you know, as a people, we are not progressing. We're actually going back. And so that was why he did these elegies. Edouard Manet, this is Berthe Morisot, a beautiful artist and a fairly well-known woman impressionist today, but it's taken many, many years for her to become well-known. She's not as well-known as Claude Monet or Auguste Renoir. Pierre Auguste Renoir and Monet are certainly much more well-known. To a certain degree, there are other artists that are also fairly well known. I will have a lecture called Overlooked Impressionist, and we will talk about some of the ones that maybe didn't get enough attention. Eva Gonzalez is one. Now, the term I want to share with you is alla prima, and that is an Italian term that is translated as at first attempt or at once. And what it means is when you paint it all in one go, wet into wet. He often finished a painting fairly quickly, remarkably quickly. Requires the artist to work very fast, decisively before the surface paint dries, and also called direct painting. Now, in Manet's situation, he sometimes is classified impressionist, and I think that's been overstated. He was associated with the impressionist, but he was not an impressionist. He's more of what I would call a social realist painter, but occasionally he did paint in a rough, loose style, and it was certainly connected to the impressionist, but sometimes he did something entirely different. So yes, he does show up in the impressionist book, but technically not completely an impressionist. Like I would again say social realist. Chiaroscuro, Italian for light dark. Chiaroscuro is the use of strong contrast between luminous quality and shadows to achieve a sense of volume and dimensionality. And this was developed during the Renaissance by Leonardo da Vinci, and also continued with in the Baroque period with Caravaggio, one of my favorite artists to talk about. And then you also have the Caravaggisti who also work in this style, and you have George de la Tour and Honthorst and others, and also further down the line, the timeline, you end up with Rembrandt, who's also using these aspects in his work. But chiaroscuro, it's light, dark contrast. That's the simple definition. Do you see how the skin almost glows in this picture? One of the signatures of Caravaggio is you will often see these dirty feet in the artworks. Okay, next, colore versus disegno. During the Renaissance, one of the arguments in art history that was going on quite a bit was colore versus disegno. What's more important? And you have the Venetians, Venice, and they were interested in vivid color. And in Florence, they were more preoccupied with drawing. They admired the work of Michelangelo. Venice was very much in complete awe of Titian. So you have different schools of thought. You have colore, Venice, disegno, Florence. And so this push and pull of what's more important? Well, the correct answer is they're both important. But back then, they wanted one to be better than the other. And so according to Vasari, who was considered one of the first art historians, I don't think the first, but certainly one of, I mean, people have been talking about art for centuries. Tuscan artists revived disegno and art was reborn. According to Lodovico Dolce, Venetian artists gradually softened their coloring until their manner equaled nature. In other words, it looked realistic. When something looks natural, it looks realistic. Rather than beginning with careful drawings, Venetian painters often worked out compositions directly on the canvas, often layering patches of colored brushwork rather than line to define form. So some people, when they paint, they carefully map it out. Everything is kind of considered where everything should be, and then some people just go with it. So it's also very much two different philosophies of how to paint. There's room for everybody, frankly. This is not a perfect situation. You're going to hear traffic noise. You're going to hear my dog come by. You're going to sometimes see him peek his head in here. And this is not a perfect educational environment, but we're just going with it. And rather than constantly re-record, and make myself absolutely crazy, I decided to pretty much, for the most part, just go with it. So be patient with us. I will be posting my lectures on YouTube links, and you can also get some perhaps links telling you more about some of these artists that I'm talking about. I'll be posting links like that on Canvas. In addition, I do like Flipgrid. It's this new idea where you can actually record, and you can talk about something, you can post it, and these short, 4-minute short video clips you can post and then respond to, and post and respond to, and both the professor and the student get to basically post something, and you almost have an online discussion, and it's pretty cool. So I might occasionally do something like Flipgrid and assign you something, a question or something to explore, and it's a neat idea, and why not? Let's just try something new. And I hope you try the Zoom. Zoom is very easy to learn. It's a little bit nerve-wracking at first. I was very resistant to doing it at first. My colleagues, some of them jumped right in. I took a couple weeks going, I don't know if I want to do that. But I ultimately did. So it is something that's probably here to stay. So in any case, major component of Disegno is Michelangelo. Again, his drawings were sensational and so realistic. And then Titian's was colore, uh, bright, vivid color. So again, you can see the contrast. So in Vasari's Lives of the Artist, it's actually still in print. It's actually the first art history book I ever bought, and that was Vasari's Lives of the Artist. And he was the first art historian to kind of talk about what was going on with the artist, who was best, who was remarkable, who he didn't like. He's not always objective, but he's one of the first really complete records we have of an art historian. Now, before that, there were people that were talking about art. We have them occurring in ancient Greece, for instance. But even so, it was, to a certain degree, the beginning of art history. Contrapposto, or weight shift, see this slight S. Greek sculpture was almost freestanding. It was as if the sculptures were about ready to just walk out of the stone. And that's one of the unique features about the Renaissance, is it became so realistic. And it was looking back to the classical past. In the center, you have the Renaissance example of Michelangelo's David. And then you also have the ancient Greek classical sculpture next to it. And you can see they're definitely continuing the ideas and even giving it a little more. So you're seeing some development as far as that goes. Verrocchio's David, also early Renaissance example, and also has that remarkable contrapposto, which is showing the skill of the sculptor. And it also is an example of Leonardo da Vinci as a young man. He was at this point an apprentice in Verrocchio's studio. And so he's this apprentice, he's in the studio, and he happened to be remarkably handsome as a young man. And so he modeled for it. So it's one of those things that's fairly accepted. Most art historians believe it is indeed a young Michelangelo. Donatello. Donatello also is experimenting with contrapposto here. And this figure, also a young male, and this is from the story of David and Goliath. And here you have this kind of a jaunty young man. He has conquered the giant, and you can kind of see that he thinks he's all that. The form is just absolutely beautiful. Henri Matisse, The Dance. This is a really good representation of contour line. A contour line is the outer edge of basically of painting. When you see the outer edge of a figure, or you see the outer edge of a vase, or you see the outer edge of a mountain, it's that contour line is that outer edge. I always laugh when I'm walking around a museum and I hear somebody say, "Oh, it's such a beautiful use of line." And I want to ask them, do you know what that means? And I don't think they do most of the time. But in any case, what it typically means is they're looking at that contour line. They're looking at just the beautiful, sinuous aspect of it. But it's just one of those things people say, and it kind of cracks me up. So Henri Matisse, he is also known for developing fauvism, bright, unnatural color. And the fauves were Duran, Matisse, Dufy, and Vlaminck. And these were young artists that were interested in seeing the world differently. And they were also enthralled with color. And so they're using bright color. Very, very innovative, sometimes unnatural, but the word fauve actually comes from wild beast, and they thought they were these young wild beasts. So when they exhibited in 1905 at the Autumn Salon, so the Salon d'Automne, it was very controversial. Not so controversial today. I mean, you look at this, you're not exactly shocked, but it was very, very shocking in its time, in the early 1900s, when people were looking at very representational, very finished, very academic art. This is Henri Matisse's famous work, Woman with a Green Stripe, also known as Madame Matisse. And this is also an example of a fauve work, and very much inspirational to the fauves. And Matisse was very much the leader, and for inspiration, he certainly, you can see the connection to Gauguin, an artist like Van Gogh. Seurat's interest in color analysis. Seurat, of course, is the one that did Sunday Afternoon on the island of Grand Jatte, the famous epic painting that's at the Art Institute. And in this particular work, you have very, very strong brushwork, and it's very much imaginative. It's certainly not representational. It's very much more to the abstract. And I have to wonder in the early 1900s how Madame Matisse must have felt about this. But she certainly was supportive of him, and it didn't hurt that she was a milliner. In other words, she produced hats, and so she was a working woman, and to a certain extent helped launch Matisse because they were able to have money coming in while he's working and not always selling. So pretty interesting. Madame Matisse. Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Nude Bather by the Sea. Remember, his late work was often these nudes. He continued producing these sorts of works for many years. And this is an example of figurative art. Also, representational art shows recognizable images, not always realistic. Shows people, animals, objects, opposite of abstraction. I like the Tate Museum's explanation the best. Figurative art describes any form of modern art that retains strong references to the real world and particularly to the human figure. Now, the found object is associated with a few artists, and one of them is Joseph Cornell, excuse me, and the other one is Louis Nevelson. All right, there was the dog. So the found objects is something that's naturally occurring or even man-made. And I have to say I have a kind of a love of it. If I'm walking down the beach and I see a Barbie arm or Barbie leg, I might pick that up. It might show up in a collage. Maybe a little. Nevelson was very well known in New York, and she worked in wood, and she usually produced large scale work. And her work tended to be black or dark brown or white or gold, typically more earth tones, if you will. And so she would use these different objects and put them in unusual juxtapositions. And she had a long career. She was very well known on the East Coast. Not as much on the West Coast, although very much well known towards the end of her life. And so this is Louise Nevelson. Now, I show this because it's a really good example of appropriation. In my classes, I often have what's called the Nevelson project, where you take an Altoid box and you take a bunch of found objects. They can be found around the house. They don't have to be found on the beach. And this is an example of appropriation in art. So it's the use of objects and images with little or no transformation applied to them. It basically is something that reflects back to a specific type of art or image and almost cites them. So these are actually, the project is called Nevelson in an Altoid box. And I do allow the students to use any color they want. You probably would not see teal or blue in many of Louise Nevelson's work. I started to say Louise Bourgeois, also one of my favorites. And so here we have, after they've kind of connected around, run around the house collecting all of these objects, they put them in these Altoid boxes, and then they spray paint them monochromatic, because she would typically do that as well. But of course, her work was large scale and this is small scale. So it's appropriating. It's not 100%, but it's certainly looking back to Nevelson's work. In addition, I'd also have them write a paragraph about their inspiration for their work. Artists always need to be able to talk about their artwork in a compelling way, because you want to compel people to purchase your work. Nothing annoys me more than when I ask an artist, tell me about your work. It is whatever you want it to be. No, 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 no. I need more. I need you to tell me more. You know, whatever you want it to be is too open-ended for me. I want to hear about your inspiration. I want to hear about your motivation. And then I also don't like untitled works. It's been done. Don't do it anymore. My opinion, but whatever. Okay, let's see. Let me move on. All right, this was also an appropriation. We have here a Nevelson's Nightleaf in black, and then the student did a little index size example, and this was done with wood, and I thought this was fantastic. And so, in any case, the students did a remarkable job. These were, when you see 150 of these laid out on the table, it's kind of wild, and it's actually kind of awesome when we go through them. Foreshortening is a technique in which an artist distorts perspective to evoke an illusion of depth. So basically, foreshortened objects appear to recede into the picture plane. Like in this case, the hand looks huge. You know that young man's hand is not that big. You know that that's skewed somehow. But the artist, has whatever's closest to you is going to be largest, and whatever's farther away from you is going to be smaller. And so this is foreshortening, or a short example of it. Frottage in art is French for rubbing. Design was made by placing paper over a textured surface and rubbing it with a pencil or crayon to produce an impression. Most of us, at some point in time, probably in some art class, you went and collected leaves, laid them on a table, and then you put a piece of paper over it, and you took crayons and you scrubbed it and scrubbed it and scrubbed it over it. And then after you did that, you lift it up and you'd have the imprint of the leaf. And they'd really make some interesting designs. Now here they've done that, and then they've taken a pen and then they've just lightly gone over it and accentuated just parts of it. So, hey, you have a lot of time right now. This is something you could be doing at home. Kinetic art. And this is art that moves. And this is an example of Alexander Calder's work. And he's the one that is largely credited with getting this started. And he liked this sense of motion. His works almost have an industrial look to them, I think. He also liked primary colors. You're not finding green in his works. Again, red and maybe blue, black and white, but you're not going to see purple in Alexander Calder's work. Now, if I wanted to appropriate his work and give it my own spin and do it in purple, well, that's appropriation. I'm changing it, but I'm certainly still in the manner of. Is it plagiarism? Not really, because you're changing it enough that it's a new idea. The Arnolfini Wedding or Betrothal Portrait by Jan van Eyck, very famous work. I always tell my students, if you're art history major, you're going to see it at least 5 times in your undergraduate classes. It just pops up everywhere, and it's a symbol of iconography, or it's an example of iconography. And so iconography refers to the subject matter or images used to convey meaning, basically signs and symbols in art. So Arnolfini Wedding Portrait. And this has many symbols. The one that immediately kind of comes out to you is, oh, that's a dog. Okay, dog's a symbol of what? Loyalty, fidelity. Now these two are just holding hands. In the 1400s, a hand clasp could show basically that you were getting married. I mean, young women didn't walk around holding anyone's hand just because. No, they were very, very protected. You know, they would never even get a letter. I mean, any sort of letter that would come to the house would be something you'd read to the whole table. So they were very protective of their young women. So again, it's signs and symbols in art. What other symbols do you see in this? Well, let's see. The fabrication would indicate that they're pretty wealthy, right? So it's like a symbol of wealth, you could say. Also, why isn't she wearing white if this is wedding? We really didn't start wearing whites consistently until the 1900s. Even through the 1800s, a woman wore her best dress to get married in. Her best dress could be pale blue, it could be pink, it could be yellow, it didn't matter. But she probably wasn't going to even run out and get a special dress necessarily. She would just wear her best dress. Well, all that's changed. We have Say Yes to the Dress. We have an incredible industry. So it's hard for us to understand. But back then, you would actually wear green often, and that was a symbol of fertility, green, vegetation. In addition, you see the little fruits that are on the windowsill, right below the windowsill. Those are an example of wealth and prosperity, and certainly to a certain degree, fertility. You could make that argument as well. And those were status symbols. You had enough money to actually have fresh fruit. Oftentimes people were barely making ends meet. So things like fruit was a luxury item. Not like the grocery stores that we experience. I mean, it was entirely different. And there's in behind them, there is a mirror. And around that mirror is actually little miniatures of the Passion of Christ, which means life of Christ. And then right above it, right in the middle of the painting, boy, this guy must have thought he was something else. Jan van Eyck signs it. Jan van Eyck was here. And they think he signed it that way to state that he was basically a witness at this wedding. His reflection actually shows up in that mirror. They think him and another person show up in that mirror. So essentially they're witnesses. So to a certain extent, this is like a legal document. And so that's a possibility. Now, why is there a bed here? You have this wedding and here's the bed. Well, this was probably probably like a living area, probably not a bedroom. Beds were like a status symbol. They were the big TV of the 1400s. Most people slept on a pallet, something even on the floor. Something like a bed would have been something that was pretty high class. And so this is clearly they're comfortable. I mean, you can see from their clothing that they have rich fabrics. This time period, again, it's a Flemish painting. You have in Flanders, money is coming in. You have some businesses were very, very successful, and you have people like this that are not aristocrats, but they're doing well. Also, I noticed she has a super high forehead. They actually used to pluck their hairline because that was considered very, very beautiful. So women would basically have that hairline go all the way back, and so they have this beautiful high forehead. But can you imagine? I mean, it's a lot of work. But in any case, let me move on. Oh, the one argument that this is a wedding is sorry, I have a dog. I have a golden retriever. You'll probably pop in here in the frame at some point in time. If any of you have golden retrievers, they're called Velcro dogs. They're always where you are. So the important symbol here is those patents in the corner. Those are these wooden shoes, and they called them patents. And he took them off. Why is he standing there barefoot? Because this is sacrament. It's one of those sacraments. So what do you do at a sacrament? You take your shoes off. Remember Moses? Moses goes up the burning bush, and one of his first commandments is to take his shoes off. This is holy ground, so this is a sacrament. He takes his shoes off. You don't take your shoes off for a betrothal. So again, I think that's one of the main arguments for it possibly being a wedding portrait. And this is one of those things that people argue about a lot. You know, the color red on that bed, is it showing a possibly virginal blood? Well, yeah, certainly. There's even a filial in the background that has Saint Margaret, and she was a patron saint of childbirth. So I don't think that was any great surprise. But there were all kinds of details. Now, I could probably talk for about a half hour on this work, but I'm not going to. I will move on. So some details, so you can see a close-up of his signature, and again, him placing his signature right in the middle of the portrait, really, was also showing that the stature of artists was actually moving up. People respected Jan. Okay, and okay, sorry. Oh, this is always so much fun. In the beginning of the semester, it's always a bit of a transition here. So in any case, the argument being that it is indeed a wedding portrait is because of those shoes being off. And the fact that he signs it in the middle of the painting is definitely an indication that the idea of an artist is very much becoming commonly known. Jan and Herbert van Eyck were both artists. His brother was also an artist, and they painted remarkably miniaturist. I mean, this is not painted quickly. This is painted very, very carefully, very, very academically. And you also noticed that there's a cross here. There's a cross that shows up in the center or the side of the window. And that's very intentional, and that would have been very symbolic. Even though this is considered a secular work, there are implications that show that the time period was still very much religious. You have one candle, one pure light. You have, again, the cross symbol. And they're just these little subtle things that point about religion, but it's, again, very subtle. Oh, one thing I should also mention, people are always going, is she pregnant? No, she's not pregnant. She's actually holding up the fabric of that gown, and perhaps a wish to be so, yes. But you often see that pose of the Virgin holding up her dress, and again, it's this kind of demure, virginal sort of a pose. Over the years, people have always sent me kind of funny things. This one's always, I've always thought it's one of the funnier ones. And you have here Vladimir Putin and Giovanni Arnolfini, and they look like they are twins, or almost. And in any way, I just always think it's fun. Impasto, thick application of paint. This thick application of paint, the word actually refers to a mixture, and it looks like icing sometimes. It's so thick, and sometimes you really want to touch it, don't, but you want to. But it was first used by the Venetians during the Italian Renaissance, but it really took hold in the 19th century. Turner used impasto, and here we have Vincent van Gogh doing impasto. Now this work is at the Norton Simon, and it's not very big. It's really quite small, but I think it's one of the treasures of the Norton Simon. It again looks so thick and so lively, and there's so much movement in it. Painters often used palette knives to create this technique, and to, again, build the paint up, and it's really quite remarkable. I like impasto works. I think it's interesting. Mannerism. Now remember, Giorgio Vasari was a painter, and he sometimes painted in a mannerist style. And if you caught that in the early slides. And so here we have a mannerism. And the mannerism originated in Florence, it goes to Rome, it spreads throughout Italy, and ultimately into Europe. And the idea of mannerism is that the artist can perceive things artistically and change things. So look at this elongated thigh. It just looks like it's just been stretched. And also those breasts don't look right. Well, Michelangelo was using models that were male most of the time. And I think this was definitely one of those examples because other than the breast, the figure looks pretty male. And again, the breasts almost look like they were, here, let's glue these on and just put them on. It has a very, very mannerist, expressive style. But mannerism is, again, it's not always realistic. It's artistic license, and the artists can do things artistically. So. Parmigianino, here's another example of mannerism, and this is a classic example, Madonna of the long neck. If this Madonna was to stand up, she'd probably be 8 feet tall. So she's very, very tall. This is also called hierarchy of scale, when the most important figures are shown very, very large, and then the other figures are not as large. The infant Christ, again, looks like he's been stretched. Looks really, really almost awkward or sickly. Some have even said it looks kind of dead. And yeah, and then in the bottom corner, you have St. Jerome. And St. Jerome translated the Bible into the Latin Vulgate Bible. So, certainly important. And so the Virgin is generally shown in 3 colors, red, white, and blue. Pretty easy to remember, isn't it? So the column was unfinished. The artist fled from Rome when it was invaded by Charles V. And so here, her neck is especially long. It almost looks like she has a few extra vertebrae in there, and very, very elongated. And that was considered very much refined, elegant. Sometimes the hands could be stretched. In fact, her hand looks a little bit mannerist. Look at that middle finger. Looks again, it's just been kind of pulled out. That refined quality. So they're definitely doing something artistically. And I happen to love her feet. Her feet are, well, size 9, size 10. I think that's pretty cool. Very, very kind of thin, elegant, long, and you don't see the little delicate feet that you usually get in art history. And then one of my favorite things in this work is the leg on the side of that. The angel, probably the sexiest leg in art history. Now the rest of the figure looks more childlike, but that leg, wow. Again, you just have a lot of artistic license is used here. And so the angels that are right next to her here are kind of congregated behind her. There's a sweetness to them. There is a playfulness to them. They look very, very childlike. And then the drapery folds in the background, that's also something they were doing in the Renaissance to frame the work and also to show rich, beautiful fabrications. And that was something that was desirable. Titian often frames his works like that, as did Giorgione. So it's a framing device that was used in the Renaissance. Medium. I think most of you know the word medium or media, and that's basically the material used to create art. It could be paint, oil, watercolor, you could use acrylic, charcoal, pencil, chalk, endless. I mean, there's a lot of media that you can use. For that matter, found objects and trash. So those can be used as media. Mixed media is what that's called. Modern. As a movement, the term modern refers to art created between Impressionism, 1870s, to pop art. So again, 1960s, which ushered in contemporary art. So on a more general scale, modern can mean current or cutting edge. Like someone might say, oh, that looks so modern. Well, they're really saying it looks, more contemporary. It looks really unique and maybe edgy. But so the word modern can be kind of used as an adjective, but as a movement, it refers to the art of the past, Impressionism to pop art roughly. Again, they argue about everything in art history. But here I have an example by Friedrich Friesike, Afternoon at the Beach, American Impressionist. He loved painting women, beautiful women, and here we have dappled sunlight that falls all over her. You can see that he's experimenting with a lot of the ideas of the Impressionists, of Monet and Renoir and Morisot, and that kind of dappled sunlight. And then we also have pop art represented here by Andy Warhol, and you have lips, Marilyn's lips. He was enthralled with Marilyn Monroe. And silk screening, that was something that he often commonly did. Repetition shows up quite a bit in pop art. And pop art is about consumer culture and about taking everyday objects that you see every day and seeing them in a new way. Robert Rauschenberg, monogram, 1950s, mixed media, there's that word. Combine equals sculpture plus paint. So sculpture plus paint equals a combine, and it's a term that's associated with Robert Rauschenberg. And so it is related to assemblage and collage and using all of these mixed medias. And here you come up with essentially it's standing on a painting, but it's very, very 3D, obviously, and sculptural. And so here we have an Angora goat and a tire around it and paint all over the Angora. It alludes to Dadaism. You have the D and the A in there. And so for this to be produced in the 1950s would have been really, really shocking for that time period. Pentimento. Pentimento means repentance in Italian. It refers to the presence of evidence that an artist has painted over a previously rendered subject. I want you to stare at a moment at the screen in the middle, kind of by his neck, and I want you to look at it. Just look. Do you see a shadowy, ghostly figure? That is an example of someone who has painted over another painting. And as time has gone, it's starting to come out. You can start to see that shadow. So pentimento is, this is an example of that underpainting coming out as a ghostly shadow. And so here, again, you see that vague outline. Hopefully you can see it. And so ultimately, his blue period old guitarist got painted over it in the early 1900s. Now, obviously, blue guitarist is turned the other way, but I think you see it better this way. Perspective. There are two main types of perspective to make objects look two-dimensional, to make two-dimensional forms look three-dimensional. Linear perspective, that's where you have a line receding in the distance, and as the railroad tracks go, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Now you know that train that is on the tracks that are the exact same size all the way down. Otherwise, there'd be a problem. But visually, when you're looking at it, it does look like it's vanishing, this vanishing point. Atmospheric perspective addresses changing color tones and the level of detail employed to paint or draw an object. And atmospheric perspective is almost always talked about when you're talking about Turner. His works are always described as atmospheric. So one of the ways you always recognize a JMW Turner is if it looks like somebody has taken wet paint and just kind of rubbed all over it and it has that kind of misty look, it's a good chance it's a Turner. That's a trick. Photorealism, the genre or artistic movement that encompasses painting and drawing that reproduce images as realistically as possible. And this is a painting by Charles Bell, and it is marbles. And he did a number of them. He was preoccupied with marbles. And so I'm going to show you several examples. It's a screenshot of several of his works. And so you can get an idea of just how remarkably photorealistic that he did indeed paint. Plein air or en plein air, I think most of you are familiar with that term. It is related to Impressionism. Okay, that was the neighbor's dog. That wasn't my dog. Winslow Homer, artist sketching and painting in the White Mountains. And so plein air painting is painting outdoors. How many times have you been to Laguna Beach? You've seen someone on the cliff painting that beautiful view over by Las Brisas. There's almost always a plein air painter right there. And while we have some time here, I urge you to go on YouTube, look up Bob Rose, and set your easel up or set a pile of books up and put a little canvas in front of it and paint with Bob Rose. There are videos in YouTube, and you too can paint a landscape. Why not? And he's certainly pretty fun. He died in the 1990s, Bob Rose, but his work is on YouTube. There's around 400 of them. So if you want to draw an ocean scene or whatever, Bob Rose. So why not? Okay, and so it's painting outdoors. And the interesting thing about plein air painting is it's all about the light. The type of image that I'm going to paint in the morning might be bright. And then in the late afternoon, you know, the colors might change a little. By the time we get to evening, you know, it may be even kind of light purple outside. And then, of course, we get, when it's dark and it's definitely, you wouldn't see much detail. So that's what you're going to be doing when you are plein air painting. You have an interest in the changing values of light. And that's Impressionism. So very much associated with Impressionism. Also with the Barbizon School, the Hudson River School, they were also going out and painting in the woods and painting scenes and producing these magnificent, huge, large-scale works. But the Impressionists were painting much more looser and, again, quicker, too, as well. This is Oscar Claude Monet's. This is the pivotal impressionistic artwork. It shows up in so many art surveys. Impression Sunrise, 1872, and this has a scene that there's no real strong discernible foreground, middle ground, and background. It's all pretty, the picture plane is all pretty flat as far as that. You don't see a strong horizon line. You don't see little rocks or little sand or in the edge of the painting. It's, again, the foreground, middle ground, and background are pretty much indiscernible. And you get the sense that it was painted fairly quickly. And he's basically painting what he sees, and he's there on one morning when, you know, the sun is coming up, and you have this sense of, oh, I don't know, that there's a little bit of fog and a little bit of light, and there's some reflection on the water. He's painting an impression. Now, originally they were called the Independents. Louis Leroy actually used the term with disdain and said, oh, those impressionists. And what he was actually saying was very negative. He thought, oh, you know, it's just an impression, you know, that's not real painting. Academic painting is real painting. The term stuck. So the Independents became the Impressionist. And so outdoor principle that of a fleeting moment of light, outdoor scenes, these are the interest of the Impressionists. So after this point, you really start to see Impressionism build. And Impressionism roughly is 1860s all the way into the 1910s, 1920s. It's there a long time because the American Impressionists start as well. It was very popular. Do people still paint in an impressionistic style? Sometimes, definitely. A ready-made. Name given by Marcel Duchamp to a manufactured object, such as a bicycle wheel or a bottle rack. His sister threw that original artwork away. She can't imagine why, which he chose. He chose to exhibit this object as a work of art. The artist makes it art by choosing it and saying it's art. And so he's most famous for the fountain, and it was signed R. Mutt, which may refer to Mott Plumbing. And there was an exhibition, and you had to pay $6 to join this exhibition. Well, in that day and time, that would have been a lot of money. I'm guessing it's roughly $100, maybe much more. But by paying the entry fee, they pretty much said that everyone would get their objects in. So, and he puts this in, a urinal. And of course, they didn't want to display that. And then he has this whole fit about it, and had a friend that was a publisher, and you know, it created a furor. I can't say that word. Anyway, it created an absolute craze. I mean, people were nutty about this situation, and so they were talking about it, and so the idea of the ready-made was born. And so here we have also the bottle rack, in which the bottle rack, I think it only had like a little slash of red paint on the edge. That was, you know, makes it art. I know conceptually it's hard for a lot of people to see. The Tate Modern regularly puts the fountain, and Marcel Duchamp, for that matter, as one of the most influential artists of all time. And so this artwork is a symbol that basically artists can do anything. They can do an installation, they can do an environmental art, they can do performance art. He really was influential. He may or may not like it, but he was influential. And also, it's not functional. Do you notice it's turned on the other way? So indeed, it's not being shown as a urinal. It's being shown on its side. So we started painting, just traditional painting, and New Descending Staircase is one of the works that he painted, and it wasn't well received, and he didn't handle criticism very well. And so he starts with that, conventional portraits, nudes, but by 1912 he basically is done with retinal art, pictures delighted to create, pictures that are created to delight the eye, in order to put painting once again at the service of the mind. So his answer was the ready-made, and so it's an art term that is associated with Marcel Duchamp, and it's art because I say it's art. So, I mean, and sometimes in some of my classrooms I have brought a small child's plastic potty chair, and I've signed it, and I've said it's art because I say it's art. But it's not as powerful now because it's been done. So, yeah, it's art because I say it's art, but it's probably not going to sell for $1 million. And again, these urinals do. So, amazing. Sfumato means smoky, and it's that background. And here you see the face of course, the Mona Lisa, and in the background, that kind of smoky background. And then here you have a Correggio, also from the 1500s. And this has these layers of color to promote depth. It has a smoky, soft modeling to it. So again, I usually just have my students understand that it has that kind of smoky effect. Almost like you're looking at something through a filter. So mysterious smile, mysterious eyes, weird background, but it does show perspective, something that was relatively new. Leonardo was known for his sense of sfumato, this sort of diffused lighting. And that kind of helps kind of explain it, I think. She has been confirmed as being Lisa del Giocondo from the Gherardini family of Florence and Tuscany, and the wife of wealthy Florentine silk merchant Francesco del Giocondo. They did find a document that finally confirmed it, but I think it's something a lot of art historians had known for a long time. Okay, woofy. Okay. It's also said that Leonardo said that Vasari wrote that Leonardo paid entertainers and musicians to entertain her while she set for the work. Well, then why didn't she smile more? But anyway, that's what he said, so go figure. In 2010, 11, it was circulating that the Mona Lisa was Leonardo da Vinci in drag. Most art historians accept it as indeed distracting. Lisa del Giocondo. Mona Lisa basically means Lady Lisa. She was important, wife of a wealthy merchant. Only people of means could basically get their portrait painted. The Gherardini family lived across the street from Da Vinci, Da Vinci's father, and so they actually did find a church record of when she died, and so it's always nice when you get some concrete evidence that kind of supports the background of this painting. And I think the main reason this is famous is because it was stolen. If something gets stolen and recovered, there's a lot of hype about it. And so it's in the news, and suddenly people realize, well, it must have special value because it was stolen. And so again, a lot of times the stolen work becomes quite famous as well. But I do not think that this was in any way, shape, or form a self-portrait. But it's interesting what people argue about. Craquelature, and it's pronounced different ways. Craquelure. Again, this is another one of those things they argue about. I mean, look at all the different spellings, and they're all correct. So this is those fine cracks or crackles that are basically on the surface of a painting, and they basically, over time, it gets this effect. And it's actually one of the ways in which they can determine whether or not a painting was forged, is sometimes because of that. And so the film or varnish over it, it causes that effect. So in any case, there's a good example here. Suprematism. Kazimir Malevich, a Russian artist, avant-garde, cutting edge, innovative, squares. Perhaps best known for a black square that he mounted up high in a corner of a museum, which is usually where the Russian icons were. And there's this black square. It was kind of a blasphemy. It was kind of shocking. So non-objective, wish to create a vocabulary of geometric shapes, independent of the visual world, expressing the truly artistic. And so when you see a room full of these, it kind of helps. When you see one, sometimes you're a little baffled, but when you see a room full or an exhibition, I think what he was trying to say becomes a little more clear.
The Russian Revolution brought dramatic changes across the country, but some of its artists were already working on creative revolutions of their own. Kazimir Malevich created a movement called suprematism. He wanted to make abstract art based on what he called the supremacy of pure artistic feeling. It was art that sought to create its own world rather than depict our own. Geometric forms float weightlessly in white space that represents infinity. Malevich's most famous work was the black square, the ultimate distillation of form and colour. For Malevich and other avant-garde artists, this time of artistic freedom wasn't to last. Art like this was increasingly suppressed and was replaced by socialist realism, which painted an idealised picture of Soviet life. Malevich turned to figurative art, but these paintings often have echoes of his earlier work, and he sometimes signed his work with a defiant black square.
Okay, Tintoretto. Here we see tenebrism, and what's one of the features of Tintoretto's work. You also have a strong diagonal. When you see diagonals in artworks, it often is a device to kind of make the viewer kind of uncomfortable, to kind of disconcert them a little bit, to kind of make them shift a little bit. So tenebrism, closely related to chiaroscuro, sacred or holy light and internal light source. Really no halos, just glowing light. Lamp and Christ glow with angels, this kind of ghost-like quality. But light is very much part of this tenebrism. So it has this kind of realm of the supernatural. Tintoretto's goal was to unite the color of Titian, Venice tradition, to Michelangelo. So he's kind of trying to bridge the gap, basically that conflict between colore and disegno. Cat in the Basket, it's more real than Leonardo's fresco in Milan, The Last Supper, which has a formality to it. This is, of course, a little bit more like pandemonium. You almost feel like you've walked into a restaurant in this particular work. So tenebrism is when there are large areas of dark color, usually relieved by a shaft of light, and again, sometimes associated with holy light. Figures are generally engulfed in shadows or streams of dramatic light. And this is again typical of the Caravaggisti later, who were fascinated with light, dark shadows and tenebrism. Tintoretto, late 1500s. This is his Last Supper. Again, it's quite different than Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. So it's a great image. I mean, there's all sorts of things going on. But the ghostly images of the angels are kind of different, maybe a little sinister. You don't have the same sort of pink little cherubs floating through the air. Georges de la Tour, one of the Caravaggisti, the newborn. This is an example of that internal light source. When we talk about a painting having internal light source, that means there's a candle on the table or there's a lamp on the table, and that light is being reflected onto the faces here. And so this is an example of this, what we call internal light source. Is it an example also of chiaroscuro? Absolutely. Look at the hand. Do you see how the hand almost glows? And the other thing that's interesting about de la Tour, one of the ways you can usually recognize a de la Tour, the hands look rubbery. For some reason, the hands in his works often have a rubbery look. I can think of a couple of exceptions, but most of them, it almost looks as if the hands are rubbery. I always see my students sitting there trying to kind of get their hands in that same position. I don't think you can, but again, it's just one of those features. The infant here almost looks a little bit waxen, but it's still, the light on it is so beautiful and the shadows are so beautiful. Georges de la Tour was one of the French Caravaggisti. In art history, avoid the word primitive. Oh, that art looks primitive. Oh, Japanese art is primitive. No, you've just indicted an entire culture. No, maybe it's a different style. Maybe it's a different style or a different aesthetic, but it's not primitive. Maybe you're going to be talking about African art, and again, you're going to talk about it being primitive. No, tribal, naive, folk, simplistic, childlike, essential, basic. Those are the terms that are acceptable, but this is one word they want to take out of the art history vocabulary. So I do like to mention that. Now let me move on. Trompe-l'oeil in French, trompe-l'oeil means fools the eye or deceives the eye, a technique that creates optical illusions of three-dimensional quality by employing eye-catching, lifelike imagery. I mean, here we have a picture frame, and there's a picture frame inside the picture frame, and there's a young male basically climbing out towards you, and this is by Pere Borel del Caso, and it's Escaping Criticism, 1874. So now this is painted in an academic manner. In fact, this painting was painted 2 years after Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise. So this is painted in an entirely representational manner, completely different from Impressionism, and would probably have taken longer. See how finely painted and detailed it is? But it's a completely different style. So he was known for his realism, and this is remarkable. If you're going, I think that looks familiar. It looks familiar because if you saw the movie Knives Out, it shows up in the movie. You actually see it in the hallway. It's called Escaping Criticism, depicts a boy in mid-climb as if burgling his way through the painting's frame. His eyes are wide with wonder of his first glimpse of the real world. And so it's a remarkable painting.